being pledged all over again. It's like college all over.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to convene the Land Use Committee hearing. I welcome everyone to the council chambers. I ask that my one and only grand rule is please turn off your cell phones or put it on vibrate to give those who are going to testify the courtesy to speak. In attendance, we have to my left, Councilman Yitzi Slifer. Second to my left is Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark. To my immediate left is Councilwoman Sharon Sneed, who's the Vice Chair of the committee. To my immediate right is Councilwoman Vice President Sharon Gray Middleton. To her right is Councilman Robert Stokes.
Mr. Chairman.
And I know that Councilman Eric Costello is here, will be joining us. I just want to say that Councilman Leon Pinkett is in the meeting, and he won't be here. And also, we have Councilman Ryan Dorsey, who's a committee member, called. He's sick, so he will not be here. I just want for that to be noted. We have Rebecca Simmons, who's the general counsel for the city council, and we have Nina Themlis, who is representing the mayor's office, and anyone who wishes to testify, there's a clipboard back up there that you can sign. And if you do want to testify, make sure you check off testify. We're here for City Council Bill 19-0462, and I apologize. Also walking that way is Matt, who is the staff person to the committee. I don't know how I could forget him, but City Council Bill 19-0462, zoning is conditional use conversion of a single-family dwelling unit to a 3 dwelling units in the R8 zoning district with variance located at 2112 St. Paul Street. This is as I said, permitting subject to certain conditions to conversion of a single-family dwelling unit to a 3 dwelling unit in the R8 zoning district on the property known as 2112 St. Paul Street, with block numbers 3810 with lot 030 as outlined in the red on the accompanying plot, and granting a variance from certain off-street parking requirements. Public notice requirements have been met. At this time, Councilman Stokes, do you want to say anything about your legislation?
Oh, it's just a conversion of a single-family dwelling to a three dwelling unit in the RA zone. Thank you.
Okay, that's a picture up here on the screen, what it looks like from the back. We will start with planning staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Martin French for the Baltimore City Planning Department. At its regular meeting on December 12th of 2019, the Planning Commission considered this City Council Bill 19-0462. It reviewed information contained in a staff report. It made a determination specifically that this bill and the proposed use would not be detrimental to or endanger public health, safety, or welfare. It would not be precluded by any other law, including an applicable urban renewal plan. It would not be contrary to the public interest. It would be in harmony with the purpose and intent of the zoning code. And it would meet all criteria for approval specified in Section 5-406B of the Zoning Code of Baltimore City. The particular property measures 20 feet by 120 feet. The structure on it measures 20 feet by 58 feet, leaving a large rear yard. The variance that was contained in the bill is specifically related to parking or off-street parking being provided on site. The rear yard can provide 2 off-street parking spaces meeting zoning code standards. And the zoning code contains a provision, 16203 section, which indicates that the requirement in the zoning code is provision of parking for additional or increased intensity of use of the property. Therefore, there is no particular need for a third parking space to be provided on this particular site, as that would be associated with the single-family use of the property originally. And that was not at that time, obviously when this structure was built back in the 1880s, required by any code. Therefore, the Planning Commission, having reviewed this bill, made its determination and additional determinations contained in the staff report, which is available to you, and determined that the bill should be recommended for approval. Are there any questions concerning this?
Any questions for planning staff? No? Okay, thank you. We are joined by Dominic McLaughlin from the President's Office. Councilman Clark, do you?
No, I just wanted to. I didn't see that we ended up needing any variances at all, just it looks by right. Wow, that's an easy vote.
Yeah.
Well, by
Okay.
right, subject to approval of the mayor and city council, obviously, yes.
Okay. Yeah, for the conversion,
Okay.
period.
Okay, BMZA.
Yeah.
The BMZA stands by its report as favorable.
Okay. DOT.
Mr. Chair, DOT stands by its report as no objection.
Thank you. Law Department.
The law department had a Bill's report talks about the need for facts to support a variance. Since the bill doesn't need a variance, we don't have to go through that rigmarole, but we probably need to amend the bill so we take the variance out. Any reference in the bill to variances should be stricken from the bill. There's a number of different provisions in the bill that deal with the variance, so I would just say that when if the committee adopts this bill, just say striking all references to a variance in the bill, and legislative reference can find those provisions.
So we don't have to do no amendment on this.
We need to amend the bill to strike out the variances.
So we need amendment. You'll have that ready for us on second.
And as I said, I don't have that amendment with me, but it can be prepared for by legislative reference.
Okay, I just wanted clarity. Okay, thank you. Well, we still have to do the finding of facts. He just did the finding of facts.
You have sufficient facts in the Planning Commission's report to approve the bill.
Okay, all right. HCD,
DHCD stands by our report in support.
okay, BDC,
BDC stands by its report as no objection.
okay, Fire Department,
Fire Department stands by its report as no objection.
Parking Authority.
Parking Authority does not oppose the passage of the bill.
Okay, do we have any public testimony on this? No public testimony. Okay, there's no, I have a cold, but, okay. So again, with the law department, instead of doing a variance, I just got to do a motion.
You want to amend the bill, striking out the variance references in it.
Okay, do I have a motion to
Yes,
move?
Mr. Chair, move to strike all references to variances that are in the text of this bill.
Okay, second by Costello. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, the amendment passed. Okay. Do I have a motion to move the finding of facts?
Second.
Robert Stokes moves, seconded by Councilwoman Clark. All those in favor of the finding of facts say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, the finding of facts is moved. And now we're moving to move the bill as amended. Vice Singer votes.
What?
Yeah, I need a motion, I'm sorry. I need a motion to move the bill?
As amended. As amended.
Yes, as
Yeah.
amended. Robert Stokes moves it. Who seconds?
Second.
Second by Councilwoman Clark. Thank you. Favor with amendments. Vice Singer votes yes. Sneed?
Yes.
Sneed is yes. Clark?
Yes.
Clark is yes. Costello? Yes. Costello is yes. Dorsey is absent. Middleton? Middleton is yes. Pinkett is absent. Councilman Stokes is yes, absolutely yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 6 favorable with 2 absent. The bill passes as amended, and this will come out March the 9th. This concludes City Council Bill 19-0462. Okay, now we will start with City Council Bill 19-0480, zoning, use standards, neighborhood commercial establishment, purpose of allowing the limited expansion of a non-residential use into a newly constructed addition to the principal building and conforming and clarifying related provisions. All the public notice requirements have been met, and at this time, if the sponsor wants to say anything, Councilman Slifer.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for hearing this bill. The idea of this bill, where it came up, was I have a constituent in the audience who will be testifying before us today, but she is a perfect example of the type of business that we'd love to have in the city. Her current business is a few feet into the county, and she is willing to come a few feet into the city, and so we appreciate people willing to do that. There has been some challenges on the books that would prevent business owners from doing so, especially small business owners, and so these changes would basically grant the ability to come ahead and get a variance as opposed to needing a zoning change or other more complicated, more costly processes of trying to accomplish the same thing. And so I look forward to having a robust discussion on the matter.
Okay, thank you. So at this time, thank you, Councilman. Planning staff? Can you also, Eric, can you also go into the Planning Commission's amendments?
Yes, of course.
Appreciate it. Go ahead.
So, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Eric Tiso for the Department of Planning and the Planning Commission. This bill was heard by the Planning Commission in their meeting of January 30th, where they reviewed our detailed staff report, which recommended amendment and approval. And the Commission recommends that the Council adopt some amendments, though at that moment we didn't have the specific language, and the Commission charged us as staff to work with the applicant and with legislative reference to come up with the detailed amendments which you should have before you. And I thank Mr. Eisenstark for his efforts and Mr. Berry as well for coming together to help us puzzle through the exact language. So first, let me start with the summary of the bill. So this is talking about neighborhood commercial establishments. This was a new form of land use that was created in our new zoning code that went into effect in June of 2017. And the purpose of why it was created is throughout Baltimore and a lot of our residential districts, we have a lot of buildings that were differently built. Either it could have been like a warehouse building in the middle of a neighborhood that, you know, the residents that worked around it worked in that building, or very typically the end of a row of row homes that was built differently with no windows, a chamfered corner, and that's where the corner stores were. And since the 1971 edition of the last zoning code went for 40-ish years, they were treated as non-conforming uses. So they had that stigma hanging over them. Well, in order to change from one form of non-conforming use to another one, it could be approved, but only if it was on the lightest commercial permitted use list, the B1 zoning category of the day, but it had to be done through a public meeting with the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. And so that added a lot of time and public hearing and posting costs and things of that nature every time that commercial use wanted to change from one use to another. So we created this neighborhood commercial establishment as a conditional use in today's zoning code. And the difference between that is non-conforming uses are presumed to not be okay in the district where they sit. They were lawfully approved at some point in time in the past, so they get to continue, but they're more or less frozen in time with a pretty strong set of restrictions on them. On the other hand, conditional uses are presumed to be okay following a public meeting where some standards are examined, and it's determined that in that location, that conditional use will not impose any worse impacts on the neighborhood than would be found in any other similar district in the city. So that's a significant shift in the status of the use to begin with. So that solves the nonconformity problem. The second problem was we wanted to give a limited palette of uses, and there are 7 of them that are listed in the zoning code. I'm looking for that list in front of me, but they involve retail goods establishments, offices, daycare centers,
Arts galleries.
art studios, personal services establishments. I think I've gotten them all out of order, but there's the 7. Thank you, Martin. So the idea was we wanted to give that limited palette of uses and allow them to move in between those uses over time without needing to be reapproved each and every time. So this bill seeks to do a couple of things. There is a technical correction where structures, the word structures is corrected to buildings. Agree with that, no problems with that, we support that. Then it also looks to add outdoor uses as something that can be approved by the zoning board. Again, when neighborhood commercial establishments were first created, we were very cautious on, how much latitude we wanted to give these, understanding that it would be a permanent solution. And at the time, staff, we were really fixated more on the end of row house type business, because that was the predominant form of these neighborhood commercial establishments that we see routinely. But the applicant doesn't have that kind of building. They have a detached, what was a home that had been used for commercial uses, and I think religious institution at one point in time. And so that is covered by this use, but it's not really what we were thinking of. What we were more concerned about is when you have either a corner bar or something like that, that turns into one of these that has a commercial component. We were concerned about a restaurant having outdoor seating because right next door, you could have a neighbor that has to hear the noise, or what if they had rear seating in the backyard, and especially thinking in southeast Baltimore, cheek by jowl in some cases that could be. So out of concern, we left outdoor uses off the table when it was first created, but there is a need to have that done, and I think that doing it by way of a conditional use approval is a reasonable way to handle that. Next, the bill allows for expansions of the neighborhood commercial establishment. The language that was in the bill was somewhat modeled after what we had in the old code that dealt with non-conforming uses, where you could take the previously approved square footage and the board could approve a 25% expansion. That's almost verbatim what we had for non-conforming uses in the old code. The challenge here is neighborhood commercial establishments are not non-conforming uses. They're conditional uses. They're allowed to be there. And it was our intent that they can have the whole building. As a practical matter, under the old code, where you had a non-conforming use, the corner store that had been in a property for decades on end, trying to administer that requirement of, okay, how much were they lawfully approved for at some distant point, in the past, so then you can then calculate no more than that 25% expansion. Well, maybe that's not enough space to be usable, and maybe even if the board gave the maximum 25% expansion, that wouldn't line up with the sizes of rooms in the building. It was a difficult thing to make work. And that was another one of the major hallmarks we wanted for the neighborhood commercial establishment, is we didn't want them necessarily limited by an arbitrary square footage within the building, because we want the buildings to be used. We want them to be maintained. We don't want to have dead space within them that's not used for anything. So expansions in this case means physical expansions. So if you have, for example, a second story that's not as deep as the first story and you want to build an addition to square off the building and fill that space, we have no objection to doing so. Where we would draw the line is if you buy the property next door, okay, and consolidate. Well, now it's on the same property, isn't it? Okay, that's not what we intended with this. And in discussion with Mr. Eisenstark and Mr. Berry, I couldn't come up with a clever way to encapsulate that. But all of these are going to a public hearing in front of the board potentially anyway, if another bill that we're going to deal with later in changes in conditional uses is adopted. So I was comfortable with leaving that issue for now. I can walk you through the amendments that we have. There are 5 of them. They're a little bit crunchy, but I think it more or less clarifies the text of the bill and makes it a little bit easier to understand what the intent was. So on the First Amendment on page 1 in line 3, in the caption of the bill, it strikes the limited expansion of a non-residential use into and substitutes text, which is the zoning board to authorize as a conditional use the expansion of neighborhood commercial establishments into, and then in line 4 after the semicolon, in the middle of the sentence there, to insert allowing the zoning board to authorize as a conditional use certain use types to be outside. So if you had that restaurant in that use, the board could authorize outdoor table service, for example, as accessory to that. Or if you had a retail goods establishment and you wanted to have, you're a grocery store and you want to have a fruit display outside or something, that could be approved.
Can I ask a question now, or do we just go back when he's
Yeah,
over?
Council, before we start with questions, there's a group here, Cornell Council Vice Chair Sneed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to our students. I just want to acknowledge them and let them know that they are actually sitting in on the Land Use Committee hearing, and we're talking about expansion of maybe a business that could be in your community. So first, I want to say that we are joined by 7th graders from Marie G. Faring Elementary Middle School, Barclay Elementary Middle School, ACE Academy. Can we just give them a round of applause for just being here? And to the teachers that are joining them as well. Thank you for all you do for our students, and thank you all for being here. Okay.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I also want to acknowledge that we have with us Councilman Bill Henry, who's in the back. Yeah. Go ahead. Thank you, Councilwoman. Eric, you got a question?
I'm happy to.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So basically, that lines, on page 2, lines 20 to 24.
Councilwoman, you want to use the microphone?
So on page 2, lines 20 to 24, that is an amendment.
That is, you're looking at
some of them were crossed out, but whatever.
Right. So the bill amends that text to give the board the authority to approve outdoor display. And we are tweaking that language a bit, which would be Amendment 3, if you have our amendments in front of you.
Okay. Oh, is there a sheet? Oh, can I
Go
have
ahead,
it?
Councilwoman, you have the microphone.
I'm sorry, I don't have the sheet with the amendments, I guess. I got them, thank you. All right, so basically, is there any limit, any size limit to the outside that's allowed? I mean, what do the people here need?
So it can,
in this case, what are they looking for?
Certainly, it can vary. And in my staff report, I dithered a bit on the outside piece because on the one hand, we're concerned about potential impacts when it's smaller properties.
Well, that's what I'm thinking about.
But in the case of the applicant that we have here, who has 11 acres? 2.5. I'm thinking of a different site. 2.5 acres. Allowing an outdoor use in the back is not as onerous. So we've left that to the board's discretion to approve any specific area with any limitations because it's going to be different on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to offer a list of requirements that are front-loaded that would make sense with a range of options that are out there. because the properties could be so different in their context, their size, how much space they have outdoors, I couldn't think of a way to.
I'm thinking more of the typical ones that you're thinking of that really usually have almost no land around them.
Yeah,
They're
and
row
that's-
houses, they're ends
That's a
of rows.
significant majority of them, I would say. But unfortunately, it's, there's a wide variety, and those are the kinds of cases where you want a zoning board. If it was so
So
easy.
basically, you're saying with neighborhood commercial, this would be one amendment which would allow just any kind of, except it can't be storage and it can't be, you can't store and you can't have display there, but you can otherwise have outside space on that property.
Well, it would potentially permit outside storage and display if the board approves it. So, and I'm not the expert on legal construction, so I will look to my left for cues. But the way this is written is you have to say you can't do any of it except as the board may approve. So the general requirement is outdoor storage and display is prohibited, but the board can approve uses to be outdoors.
Okay, thank you.
That's what we're trying to get to. So that, because you can have such a wide variety of these buildings that existed that have commercial uses in them, that's why you need a board to look at them individually. If they were all the same, then we would just codify it and have done. So that's where we are on that one.
Yeah, I hear what you say. It's just, this is a business that is highly regarded, and we'd like to have what it wants to have and to be in the city.
But we're writing rules for the city,
Right.
the city as
And
a
so
whole.
that's why I'm asking a lot of questions, because neighborhood commercial's been,
It's a favorite topic,
well,
I know.
it's my favorite topic, yes. And I have met with the sponsor, and so I do know the business, and
Yep.
I'd like to help.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But this is citywide legislation. So
I know.
While we're sympathetic, we do need to be somewhat careful. And then our Amendment 4 is in that exact area on page 2 in line 25. It strikes limited expansion and just says expansion. And then strikes non-residential use and substitutes neighborhood commercial establishment, because we're talking about neighborhood commercial establishments as defined here. We don't want it to be confused with any other non-residential use that's there. So if you have
Which one are we on right now?
Amendment 4,
Amendment 4, and that's on page 2, line 25.
coincidentally in the same spot, yes. So I wanted to make sure it was clear that, that we're calling them neighborhood commercial establishments and not confusing it with just any non-residential use that might have coincidentally been there.
Expansion of use, and so you're leaving that in, you're not striking it out.
Well, we're substituting, instead of non-residential use, we're substituting neighborhood commercial establishment, because that's what we're talking about here. It's more clear.
Use and, all right, so it says now, I'm sorry,
Sure,
everybody.
so if we're looking at the bottom of page
Strike-
2,
Strike, all right, expansion. Read me,
sure. So the last 3 lines on page 2.
yes,
Would read, the zoning board may authorize as a conditional use the expansion of a neighborhood commercial establishment into, and then the rest of the paragraph. So it's just swapping neighborhood commercial
the
establishment in for
principal building
non-residential.
as long as the floor area of the use in the newly, so, is that the end of the sentence? Where does the sentence end, that your amendment?
It's in line 27 on page 2. And then it continues.
So it goes after building, what about as long as the floor area of the unit?
Okay, so in line 28, after building, we would say on the same property, period. And then the rest of that, as long as, and rolling over onto the next page, talking about the 25% goes out. So let me read the whole thing to you then.
Please.
Okay. So it would be, the zoning board may authorize as a conditional use the expansion of a neighborhood commercial establishment into a newly constructed addition to the principal building on the same property, period. The rest is struck.
No 25%.
No 25%.
You can build a building next to the building and expand into it, and there's no limit on how much.
Well, no, we don't want to go into the next property. That's not the intent.
Well, I
here.
mean, you wouldn't,
Yeah, that's not the intent here. Now,
but what would stop you?
well, that's the concern. I don't know a good way of how to limit
I
that.
can't do this.
But these would be in front of the zoning board.
I know, and I have a lot of respect for the zoning board because we've been there.
Sure.
And they've paid attention to us and helped us. But they're not, there's no, I mean, I also lived with a building on St. Paul Street for years that was a horrendous bar.
Right.
And it was because two buildings were put together, and then they used neighborhood commercial to expand to the second floor. It was, now finally someone else bought it, thank goodness, but.
Sure. So, yeah, one of the things we wrestle with, and
can't do this.
Mr. Baumgartner, feel free to jump in whenever you'd like. The way I understand how the board administers these is the criteria for being a neighborhood commercial establishment has some wording along the lines of is located in a building that was originally constructed for or previously approved for a non-residential type use. Okay, so as I understand it, the board views it by definition as the original building. Okay, and so they were reluctant to approve any additions to the building, even though it would comply with the amount of stuff you can build on that individual property by the zoning code. They were treating it more or less as frozen in place. That's the part that should prevent an expansion into a property next door. Now,
Unless they buy it and they,
well, that was what I was trying to get
Well,
ahead
you-
of,
yeah,
to make
I
it as
lived with
clear as
that one
possible,
for
because
years.
I think I know the same location that you're thinking of
Sure.
in your district. But I couldn't come up with the foolproof wording to say you get the original structure, but you can't go into the structure next door. Because once
I see.
it consolidates, you're absolutely right. It's on the same property,
then they.
isn't it?
And that's what happened there at that place.
So I don't know a way to hardwire that into the code so that it will work in all cases and not create some collateral damage somewhere. So at the moment, the only thing I can suggest is we have to trust the board to understand that by definition, it's the original property and they can build within the original property, but they should not be crossing into a next door property that was not part of that original building. Because we don't want that domino effect,
Right.
you know, where the corner store buys the next one and goes down the line. And I'm willing to take any suggestions if anybody
But
can think of it.
Can I just say, look,
I want to go with, Councilwoman, I want to go with BMZA
Yeah.
to help you out, and after BMZA, Council Vice President Sharon Green Middleton has a question, right? Yeah.
So to offer a little bit of a safety valve to the
Can you speak up a
councilwoman's,
little bit?
sure.
Yeah.
To offer a little bit of a safety valve for the councilwoman's question, both the definition of neighborhood commercial establishment and 14328 sub A says because neighborhood commercial establishment uses apply only to certain already existing buildings, the board has traditionally interpreted that to mean just that structure. So if there were an instance where a neighborhood commercial establishment owner or operator would buy an adjoining piece of property, if that adjoining piece of property was never used for anything other than a residence, you would not be able to expand that neighborhood commercial into that adjoining structure.
so can we say prior to any consolidations with other buildings?
I just had a suggestion from Mr. Eisenstark that we could say on the same original property.
Yeah, go ahead, you could take care of it.
That would help.
So
Yes.
if that would help.
Yeah, but I
because
mean, this is not how to
Yeah, we want
plan
to
a
keep it
bill,
on the
but
same
we'll do it if
property.
that we need to.
But if they want small additions, you know, that fit within the zoning code for that same property, they should be allowed to have that.
But prior to any consolidations
Correct.
with other properties?
Correct.
Okay.
I would simply add that if that neighboring property also qualified as a neighborhood commercial establishment, that would be allowed. So if you have an instance where you have
It's a
two
different address and
properties,
it qualifies as?
Zone the use. yeah.
correct. But if that adjoining property was a single-family dwelling or multi for, an entire century, it would not qualify.
If they weren't consolidated, if they were side by side, one was a tailor and one was a shoe repair shop, and they were in the first floor of two row houses on the end of the group, but they were two separate properties at the time of the appeal, then these guys couldn't go there and these guys couldn't go there. Now, later, they could have every right in the world to consolidate, and they would consolidate with all that commercial space restored to the ground floor. Furthermore, in neighborhood commercial, there's no limit to how much of a given property you can go into. So you can go into every square inch, including, the fireplace, and with your commercial use. It never limits square footage. Once you got the property, you got the commercial use, and you've got it, you can go 100% in that building. So as long as it would say prior to any consolidation.
The amendment.
Yeah,
Right.
we're happy to amend our
Okay.
That would help.
amendments.
All right. Council, before you go, Councilwoman Middleton is next, then Councilwoman Sneed.
Thank you. I guess my question is along the same lines.
That helped me with
I'm
that.
just kind of
I'm just trying to.
envisioning the floodgates of a whole residential area becoming, commercial in a sense. And I know in a part of my area, I have an abundance of assisted living facilities and so on that we're trying to correct through the state. And is there, I just see some, if this starts, there's going to be residents that are probably going to be upset. Just tell me the process of, if you could just go through a quick process of how it would be approved.
Sure.
Are the community associations involved, or just tell, I need to know a process.
Okay, sure.
So planning and also BFZ, if they want to
Yep.
help out with Councilwoman.
So there is a non-conforming use that's in a residential property. It's been there for decades, which is why it's allowed to continue. They would like to take advantage of this neighborhood commercial establishment because without this relief, in order to keep the business there and be able to change it, they're probably going to be tempted to ask you for a rezoning to C1. Okay, we don't want that because it brings in a whole lot of other things. So we want to encourage them to use this neighborhood commercial establishment because it limits them to a shorter palette of 7 uses. If they didn't know, they would file a permit, and then the zoning staff would tell them, oh, you need to get this use established, go see the zoning board. They would file a public hearing in front of the zoning board. Our district planners typically notify the community organizations in the area soliciting their comment. We represent the department and any comments we may get from them at a public meeting in the zoning board. They have a 21-day posting period where that big sign is on the front of the property. Anybody that's interested in participating can show up and state their concerns of, hey, we have a concern that, this, let's say it's a restaurant, is here, but, we have some concerns about it going late night. We want you to put some conditions on it for days and hours of operation, maybe other things that make sense to them at that time. The board will weigh that according to the conditional use standards and will render a decision, and then that's what that person has. Now, again, the benefit here is by having a neighborhood commercial establishment is it doesn't just freeze them into that one use. They've got a few uses that it could change between over time, which makes it a little bit easier to handle instead of, again, they're frozen in time, can't do anything, and then they're asking you for a rezoning. And then since it's probably a spot zoning, it obligates the planning department to say, we don't think this meets the state standards and recommend disapproval. So that's the bigger picture that we're looking at here.
Can I comment?
Yes.
Councilwoman, go ahead, so we can move on. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I think there's a report, I think in this report, there's a statement that should be understood as well. I disagree with it. I don't think it's the fact, but it's in this report. And what it says is that there are 7 groups under neighborhood commercial that people can apply for. So like art studios, galleries, arts, offices, personal services, general retail. I don't think I've covered them all, but almost.
That's the big
There are
ones.
7. But this report says, although it's not part of the report on this bill, it's in the report of this bill, that from planning's point of view, once you have one neighborhood commercial use approval, you never have to go back to the zoning board for any change whatsoever with your use. Right?
That is the way it was intended to be designed, yes. Now, of course,
It is,
when
but
the
it's
board-
not in the law. It's not.
I'm willing to be corrected on that, but
I just want to say to everyone who says, what are the implications? That once you get a yes on one application under neighborhood commercial, let's say it's for a barber shop under retail goods, then the owner of the barber shop goes broke, the owner needs to lease the property, the owner wants a corner store, the owner doesn't have to go back to the zoning board to get it. He gets it by right. And when that changes to the next thing, they get it by right. And even if it goes from one of those 7 categories to another, you don't have to go back to the zoning board. In other words, this is an eternity issue. So this one place is worthy enough and well regarded enough for us to spend all this time trying to find a way citywide to fit them in, because they deserve it and they have a good representative who's worked like crazy to try to figure it out. So that's what we're doing here, and I'm sorry if I'm taking time, but I live with this a lot.
No, that's absolutely an astute observation, and yes,
And
that is a
correct, right?
concern. So, again, I know we tend to fixate on the corner store and row house districts because there are so many of them, but there are other cases where you have a larger former warehouse building that might be split into a couple of different tenants that might have a variety of uses that may change over time. So if it needed to go back to the public hearing each and every time any one of those subcomponents changes, you're pushing that property owner to ask for a rezoning, and they are probably going to go to C1, which has no parking requirements, has a longer list of uses, has all of these things. So I understand the concern. I don't want to minimize that, but just we're trying to provide a tool that is a middle ground between what we had under the old code, which is keep them as non-conforming, and push them to get a commercial zoning district.
Mr. Eric
Yes,
Tissot, Mr. Tissot, we'll have this conversation tomorrow at the Planning Commission with my bill.
Yes.
I just wanted to answer the Council Vice President, or respond to, she's saying, what's the process?
Yes.
So, and Mr. Chair, we've talked about the consolidation amendment. And so what else so can we go on with your amendment?
Yep, the only last amendment we have, number 5, is very simple. On page 3, lines 5 through 32, strikes them in their entirety. That's the part that talks about nonconformities. These are not nonconforming uses, so we don't need that whole section.
Sorry, what page?
On page 3 of the bill, from line 5 to the end, there are no amendments needed for Title 18 at all because this is not a non-conforming use of the bill. Yep, and that's the
Oh,
end of our
that's an
amendments.
amendment, is take all that out. So
Correct.
what are the two amendments? I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to, so what are the amendments that are real? The ones on the sheet, what are they? That's what's real?
1 through 4, with amendment number 4 being slightly modified, which would be at the top of page 2 of our handout, where it says, on the same property, we would insert original, so it would say on the same original property. And that way, that prevents that moving into the next door issue. And I think that is the end of my presentation.
Okay.
Thank you for bearing with me. and
Thank you,
Happy to
Eric.
take
If
any other
anyone else
questions.
has any questions or concerns, Councilwoman Sneed? Eric? Councilman Costello?
No.
No? You don't have any?
Oh, so I just want to make sure, we are not, if I am if it's a business next to me and they're, I don't know, a bookstore, whatever, and it's a residence next to it, it will not be, and they buy the property right next door, they will not be approved to just expand and become.
That is correct, and that is our intent. We don't want it to go.
And that is in, we are putting that in, that's going to be the amendment to go in, 'cause that's the one we are.
Yes.
If you adopt our amendment number 4 as modified, yes, ma'am.
So Councilwoman
that's-
Clark's amendment, so,
Well, that's the one that, with the no consolidation.
Yes.
right.
So that's that one. I'm sorry, I just got to know. how-
This is complex. Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Amendment, the outdoor one, how did we leave that?
It's up to the board to approve what they may have outdoors. So because all of these properties are different, it's hard to put a standard list of conditions hardwired into the code. So the board would need to enumerate in their approval that they may have, X area and whatever else they may find is necessary in that
So
context.
if it's this place, and it changes hands, and they have a different, maybe a more intense plan for the outside uses, maybe put a roof over it and have it outside and use it, from October to, or April till October.
Sure.
And that's not the understanding of the neighbors now.
Right, we would
It
encourage.
doesn't have to come back to the zoning board to approve that change, does it?
Well, we would, if you're changing from one owner to another, I don't see where we need to go back to the board just because it's a different owner. Now, we would encourage the board to be specific in their approval what may be had outdoors.
By this establishment.
Yes.
But this establishment someday, maybe hundreds of years from now,
Right.
will, maybe change hands.
Sure.
And these rules apply, and the outside use, which I have no idea, I presume the neighbors know what the outside use is.
That's my understanding. So
And
whatever
then-
they're
but
authorized.
But they won't know yet what the new establishment's plans are, and they will not have, under what you're saying, the opportunity for the neighbors to have a hearing or with the board about what the plans are.
The change
all.
the change of owner is immaterial, but that new owner inherits that approval as it sits. So using the specific example, if the Ivy is approved for, and I'm going to use a random example that may not reflect what they want, you can have, group readings outdoors and a coffee shop takes over. If the coffee shop wants outdoor readings in that same spot, the same way that this original one was approved, they can do it. If they want to have something else, well, that's not the approval.
So you still have to go back to the board to get the.
If you want that changed. So that's why the
Right.
board will need to be specific
'Cause
in what they approve to make sure that there's not.
Not what he says okay. So that's the discussion for tomorrow, because you can't have it both ways. That you never go back, you never have to go to the BMZA again, versus if you change your design for your outside, the use of the outside space,
Right.
that you can go back. The neighbors can get a public hearing.
Right. So I think part of the confusion is that there's two different things. One is the indoor neighborhood commercial establishment and the 7 defined uses, okay?
Yeah.
In my reading, once you're established as a neighborhood commercial establishment, by definition, it includes that list of 7 things. Okay, this bill says,
I know you think that.
as approved by the board, separately, you may do something outdoors. That's a different specific approval. Okay, so both of those two things can exist simultaneously. Where you can have that, and I use that coffee shop example specifically because it's a
Okay.
restaurant, it's one of those 7 uses. Okay, but the separate approval for the outdoors has to follow the board's original approval for the outdoor portion. And the more specific they are, the more that straitjackets a future user of that outdoor
But
space.
those future people have the right to come back to the board. If they call up and the neighbors say, look, a lot of changes going on, and we want a hearing, a public hearing, can they get it?
Yes, any change in a conditional use requires a new public hearing. So if you have the operator of that property, which is a bookstore that
Okay.
authorizes outdoor readings could be continued for any future operator. But if they wanted to change that use to outdoor
use, yeah.
entertainment or to build a gazebo and have
Correct.
other things, that would be required to come back to the board for a
But they're-
separate
okay.
conditional use.
I see you. I hear you. Please both stay in your jobs for a long time.
I will do the best.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Vice President is correct. This is very important. It is complex. Okay, so since there's no more questions for the Planning Department, BMZA?
The BMZA had no objection to the intent of the bill. We had some concerns about the actual text matching the intent.
Yeah.
Legislative references, current amendments do cure those concerns. The other concern we had was just that the language was very clear moving forward as to exactly what the board had the authority to do and not do. With those amendments, we are satisfied that they do match the intent of the bill, and so we have no objection.
Question.
Councilwoman Clark?
So those, because I'm having a hard time, I have a hard time reading fast. I'm not clear, but I'd like to be clear. I mean, I'd like to support this. It's just the whole city that's affected. So is there any way that we can get clearer? Well, I guess there's not. So people can come back. I mean, it is actually existing law, but it's not stated any longer. That's what my case is over at the Planning Commission tomorrow. Okay, I get it.
And I would
I hear what you're
simply-
saying. You think we can live with this, and the zoning board is open in neighborhood commercial to get over this idea that once you've got something, you have it for life and you never have to see this place again. I'm exaggerating.
Fair enough. I would add that the board has a lot of discretion to apply very specific conditions to very specific properties.
Right.
So there were a number of cases that the board denied under neighborhood commercial prior to this bill. One in particular was a coffee shop that wanted two top tables outside so that their patrons could have their coffee outside. The board had to deny it because the language in the current code says that you can't have any kind of outdoor uses. So this particular bill would fix that, not to just give them carte blanche to be able to put,
I see.
20
So-
tables out there, but the board could authorize 2 tables on that corner, and if they ever wanted to come back and put a 3rd table, they would have to come back to the board
Okay.
to change that use for that 3rd table or 4th.
Mr.
Before Councilwoman,
Yeah.
I think Councilwoman Clark in Middleton, I can't speak for, but I assume that what they're talking about is that carte blanche.
Yeah.
Yeah, Councilwoman Clark, you want to end this with
Yes.
whatever you have to say? Go ahead.
What I would say is to the sponsor of the legislation who has worked so hard and talked to all of us about this, and it's not a hard sell because we know the establishment. However, I would ask that the sponsor and the owners and all involved write the very detailed plan, what you want, what you're getting, so that it's part of the board. I'm sorry, all right, it's the council now. How does this work? If we have to approve this and then you have to go to the board. Okay, good. When you get to the board, write a very detailed description, especially of the outdoor use and plan, coverage, square footage, roof, if there is one or not one, all that kind of stuff, even where the trash cans go. Okay.
They should be more specific, the applicant, that's what you're saying.
I'm saying be more specific than we ever dreamed of, which I'm going to ask every one of my people who come through neighborhood commercial to do from now on with the zoning board.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been to DOT yet? I lost track. DOT?
Yeah, Liam was
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
before.
Yes, so DOT is happily stands by a report which is deferred to the Department of Planning.
Housing did.
Okay, thank you.
We did housing.
Law Department?
The law department had some issues with how some of the drafting was done, but the amendment number 3 of planning's amendments solves my problem.
Okay, that's the agency reports. Do we have any public testimony?
Oh, boy. Okay.
Not to extend this too much further, but one of the properties that was in Councilman Schleifer's district is owned by Emma Snyder, who's the owner of the Ivy Bookstore. And she bought a building which was a non-residential building and has 2.5 acres of land around it and wants to use that for programming. And the board would have been prevented, we got approval from the board to use the building, but the board was prevented from using any of the outdoor space. There have been several other examples that I've been involved in, several in Councilman Costello's district, frankly, where we came to the board, got approval, but couldn't use the roof, for example, or we weren't allowed to expand it even onto a portion of the roof. So that's where some of this has come from. Over just experience in the last 2.5 years. The amendments that Planning Commission recommended and that were worked out with legislative reference and were worked out even today are fine. I would just say personally that a lot of us that do this were under the assumption that when you get a conditional use for a neighborhood commercial like a bookstore, that if any change, whether outdoors or indoors, had to go back to the board under the change of, so the idea that we were not promoting any idea that you escape that by any of these amendments. So I think your clarification and what's been said today is sufficient. And I just say to Councilwoman Middleton, neighborhood commercial doesn't apply to the whole city. The lower residential zones are exempt from neighborhood commercial. So I know that was a condition that the planning department originally transformed to not let the lower density residential areas apply for neighborhood commercial.
Okay, I just,
May I say something about that?
naturally, go ahead, Councilwoman.
I've always thought that was a very discriminatory choice. I know it wasn't yours, Mr. Barry, because all of the B1As and all the way through B4 can't even get neighborhood commercial. It starts with all the densely, it's really that corner store image. Densely occupied places, God bless you. And so it's R, residential 5 to residential 10.
I suspect there may be an amendment at some point because there are non-residential buildings in some of these lower density zones that may, at some point in the future, like an old school or a fire station or whatever, that's exempt from that provision. But that's a subject for another day and somebody else.
Today ain't that day.
To the weeds with
I know.
that, yeah.
I just wanted to remind the council and Councilwoman Middleton.
Ms. Berry, for your applicant, I just want her to understand that with the hearing where Councilwoman Clark and Councilwoman Middleton are concerned, and they want those specifics, and as planning said, a straitjacket, or as the zoning board says, not carte blanche. So I hope you understand
Yeah.
what's happening today. We're not grilling against you or anything like that. It's just that we're concerned about the district.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, in no way, my interpretation is that people are trying to facilitate something, and I'm really appreciative of that. Yeah, my name's Emma Snyder. I'm the owner of the Abbey Bookshop. Purchased a building in Baltimore City on Falls Road that we're renovating into the store. Worked with the BMZA to get the approval for it as a bookstore coffee shop. My understanding has been, as the owner of the building now, that is the exclusive sort of, that is the entirety of what we could do there into the future. And so my assumption has always been for any kind of alteration. But I will also say I'm working with a landscape architect on a sort of site plan that would be phased in over time. So that's exactly, my understanding was this meeting was just to allow for the potential for me to go back with a hyper-specific plan. And even when we met with neighborhood associations a year ago at this point for that original BMZA resolution, what was described was kind of the property, and a lot of the community said, could you do this outside? Could you do that? And at that time, we talked through what people would like to see, the use of summer programming for children, things like that. But all of that is excluded from the current possibility. And so what this is for them to me to then be able to come back with an extremely specific plan of these are the sorts of programs we want to do. This is the sort of space we want to use. Here is a kind of a landscape architectural rendering, et cetera.
Yeah, it's appreciated that you did go out and talk to the community. So without any further testimony, do I have a motion to move the amendments?
Mr. Chairman, as modified.
Huh?
With the
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead, thank you.
that we had that amendment to our proposed amendment number 4 to insert the word original between same and property. If you would like to consider that modifying my original set of amendments to avoid a double vote, however you wish to do that.
Okay.
Read the amendment out loud. That's just
So on the
what I said.
top of page 2, we would insert original between same and property. So it would say on the same original property.
Is that clear enough? That it's not?
I
that-
believe so.
Okay.
That's.
Derek? Yeah? Law Department?
Yep.
Yes? Okay, well, good. So do I have a motion to move the amendments?
Second.
Moved by Sneed, second by Clark. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, the amendment's passed. Now we got to move the bill favorable as amended. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Sneed, do I have a second?
Thank you.
Sneed moves, second by Costello. Vice Singer favorable as amended. Vice Singer votes yes. Sneed?
Yes.
Sneed is yes. Clark?
Yes.
Clark is yes. Costello? Costello is yes. Dorsey is absent. Middleton? Middleton is yes. Pinkett is absent. Stokes? Stokes is yes. We have 6 yes with 2 absent. This bill passes with the amendments. It will come out March the 9th. I want to thank everyone. This concludes City Council Bill 19-0480.